right, great to see a good crowd this morning. We are currently in a new lesson today starting, and there are still a ton of notes on the back table if you did not get a copy of that. But we are starting chapter 9 of Genesis today in our study of the life of Noah. So if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, and today we are in lesson number 10, and that sheet has about 6 questions on it, and I'll give you a forewarning where we're going with this. Today we're going to try to cover 3 of those questions. Question number 4, we'll spend all the next session on just question number 4, and then we'll finish up the next week. I'll probably go ahead and put out some new notes next week. So you'll have a couple of weeks to work on those. But if you've looked at the notes, then you know that question number 4 is about the part where God says, whoso sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And there's the principle of capital punishments. First time we really see that in Scripture outlined the way that it is. We're going to talk about that from a scriptural perspective. What does God teach about that? And how would Noah have understood that? So that's what we're going to talk about coming up next time. Today we've got a couple of questions, really in verses 1. We're going to jump into verse 6 in the third question, but we'll do 1 through 6, and then hit verses 5 through about verse 7 again next week in that question, and then we'll finish out the part about the rainbow and God's covenant and the token of that in the rainbow the next week. That'll be 3 weeks from now. I meant to say, sometimes when you mention things in sermons, every now and then somebody remembers that and they'll just square you away with some memorable something or other. And I've told you before about my love for cranberry sauce, the jellied cranberry, and someone thought it so nice they got me an ornament of cranberry sauce last night. And I feel loved and appreciated, and I want you to know that. It's even see-through in the top, just like the jelly is in the top part of that. And that's the real version of that is just the best stuff in the world for Thanksgiving. So I appreciate that. All right. Lesson number 10. All right, so the first question in lesson number 10 deals with the first 2 verses of chapter 9. Here's the question, and then I'm going to read those verses, and then we're going to go back and discuss what's going on in verses 1 through 3. All right, question number 1. Is there a difference in the relationship between man and animals after the flood, verses 1 through 3? And how can animals dread people? So let me read that, and then I'll open it up for discussion. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Everything that moves, or every moving thing that lives, shall be food for you. I've given you all things, even as green herbs." Okay, so the question is, do you think there's a difference in the relationship now after the flood? And how is it that animals can dread people? Your thoughts? Yeah, Bobby? Okay, so there's a difference in dietary conditions that might have changed that. Do you see pre-flood and post-flood a difference in the relationship between man and animals? Does it seem to be different now? Like before the flood, what does it seem, if you could describe the relationship of animals and man before the flood, what would that be like? If you read chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis, and you kind of look at the relationship of Adam and Eve and the animals, what does it seem like the relationship was? Yeah, there didn't seem to be any fear. In fact, what was the one great task that Adam took upon himself, obviously so designated by God, to do with the animal kingdom? He named them all. Would that have implied close contact with them? Inspection? But now it doesn't seem as though that exists anymore, so there does seem to be a relationship. Now let's look at the text, because obviously there's some things that seem very familiar to us about this and some things back at chapter 8 that seem really, really familiar to us. So in verse 9, verse 1, or chapter 9, verse 1, when he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, is that something that sounds familiar to earlier commands of God? Yeah. Yes, it is. So look at Genesis chapter 1. Look at Genesis chapter 1. Let's go back just a few seconds to Genesis chapter 1. And drop to verse 28 beginning. And God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over everything that moves on the earth. And then he says, I've given you every green herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, to you it shall be for food. So the language is extremely similar. In fact, if you were to make sort of a bulleted list of things between Genesis chapter 8, verse 16 down through verse 19, about be fruitful, multiply on the earth, verse 17, and then in chapter 9, verse 1, and you compare that with the earlier statement in chapter 1, there's a lot of similarities. There's a similarity in God expressing that man has dominion over the animals. There's also statements about provisions for food. That's changed, like Bobby mentioned. There's even in chapter 9, verse 6, and in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, we'll talk about that in a moment, a statement about the image of God. That's all similar. The only thing that changes is now God talking about the animals dreading human beings. So something has obviously changed between the two. So the relationship between man and animals changes, especially since Bobby mentioned, I think is right, the diet changes, and now there's the consumption of animal meat versus the original command in chapter 1 about just eating the green herb. The word dread here means terror. That's what the word means. So there is an innate terror that's been placed within animals to fear mankind in general. However, if we watch really carefully, there's something not mentioned in this list. All right, so look at verse 2. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth. There's one category. On every bird of the air, there's another category. All that move on the earth, there's another category. That'd be the crawlers, ground crawlers. And all the fish of the sea. But there's a category of animals that's not listed. Can you think of it? What's not listed here? Okay, some sacrificial type animals. In other lists like this, especially in Genesis 1, it'll talk about beasts of the earth, birds of the air, things that crawl on the ground, aquatic animals, and it'll say the cattle. It'll say cattle, which is a representation not just of cattle itself, but a representation of domesticable animals. And so while there may be an innate fear among a lot of animals on the earth toward mankind, are domesticable animals generally favorable toward people? Dogs, cats, cows are cows, but they generally are pretty gentile with, people and are genteel with people. And so it seems to be that God has specifically left out the category of domesticated animals because they generally don't fear people. Now, if there's an abusive situation that might be, but domesticated animals are excluded from the list. And all of those animals, even the domesticated animals, at the very end of verse 2, God says, what are they? They're given into what? Into your hand. What's that mean? We're taking care of. Even the animals that dread humans, we're supposed to take care of. Yeah. We've been given stewardship or dominion over the entire earth, meaning that we have to be responsible and moral in our dominion over the animal kingdom. But is it fair to say that even in Genesis 3, but again in Genesis 6 through 9, has sin changed drastically the relationships that exist on the earth? From the very beginning until now, has sin changed all those relationships? Very much so. Here's an example of one. Go back to chapter 3, Genesis chapter 3. Look at verse 17. And then I want to read something from Romans about how the world was affected by sin. But look at chapter 3 of Genesis. Verse 17. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and you've eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. You shall eat the herb of it. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. From dust you are, and to dust you return. When you read chapter 2, when God puts man in the garden, what was man supposed to do to the garden? Tend it, right? So he was always going to work. But does it seem as though sin has changed the relationship of the earth to man? Like it's been affected. It's not the same anymore. And the flood is sort of an additional nail in the coffin of that, so to speak. There's been a change in the world, but it's been affected by sin to where the world doesn't, like we have dominion over it, but it's hard now versus what it was at the beginning. And look at Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. And start with me in verse 18. Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 18. Now, what he's going to do in this passage is personify the earth. He's going to personify the world. So it's not a person under consideration. It's the world. But when you personify something, then you can assign feeling to it, right? You can assign emotion to it. And this is, in a personified sense, this is the way the world feels about the entrance of sin into the world. Verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. For the earnest expectations of the creation, the created universe, eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. Talking about the time when, the last act of redemption, the scheme of redemption will be when the world will be dissolved and eternity begins for us. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Now he's using the illustration of the pain of birth, the birthing of a child, that excruciating pain, to talk about how, in a personified sense, the world feels, right? It doesn't really feel, but it's sort of helping us to understand the effect of sin in the world. And then he'll go on to say some other, he sort of turns his attention toward us, and then the expectation of our hope in verses 23 and following. But he's using that language to say relationships change in the world. So there's been a dramatic change in the physical universe toward people. And our relationships are different, including, according to chapter 9, the relationship of man and beast. And there was this getting alongness that existed in the first couple of chapters of Genesis in creation. And now animals, while we have dominion over them, they don't sometimes behave toward human beings. And there are many that have dread and terror of human beings. There's just, in many of them, an innate fear. And even among domesticated animals, there can be moments when they lash out against people, and that never existed before, which now existed. Carl? Yeah. I think there was probably some getting alongness among them, at least at first. They probably stayed much together, and it appears to have changed a lot since then. And sin has changed all those relationships in the world. Any thoughts on that? I just think it's just interesting to think about in verse 1 through 3, where he's saying the relationships between man and beast change. Gene?
Well, early in Genesis, you get the impression that humanity, and maybe even animal life, were vegetarians.
Yes.
But when you look at the sacrifices that apparently Adam and his children commanded to give, they obviously sacrificed to him.
Yes, they did.
And if it's anything like what Moses was taught to do, not only did they sacrifice it, they just didn't throw that meat away.
That's right. You would consume it. Yep, that's right.
So I don't completely comprehend what's being told.
Yeah. Yes, I understand. Tom?
Regarding
Sure. Yeah, that's right. That's a good point.
There's also a possibility that God had to go that way in order for survival of the animal kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
to be fearful of man, because there are a lot of people that, I mean, even today, that abuse animals and in different ways. And I think sometimes it could be a survival instinct.
Yeah.
of the animal.
Well, I mean, in chapter 9, you're literally exiting the ark, and the entire world of animals we have now came from the few animals that come off of the ark, minus the ones that were sacrificed. So I think that's part of it. You know, he has to preserve the life of the animals, and as the population of men grew, you would have people who would, just same as today, hunt them down, and it's possible to wipe them out before they had a chance to populate the earth. So there's probably some of that involved in it. I think that's a good point as well. All right. Gene, you mentioned something. I'm going to get to this vegetarian thing in just a second, because let's get to the second question. I think it goes right to the second question. Why is blood prohibited from their diet in verses 3 and 4? And we're going to consider this from a lot of different angles. Perhaps even there's maybe even like a theological, maybe God was teaching them something spiritually here. Is there perhaps a much deeper lesson being taught, and what might that be? Let me read verses 3 and 4 of Genesis chapter 9, and then I'll open it up for some discussion. So here's verse 3. And then again, he's talking to, these are conditions being given to Noah and his sons and the family there. So every moving thing that lives shall be for food for you. I've given you all things, even as the green herbs. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And then there's a lot more discussion coming next week on verses 5 through verse 7. But verses 3 and 4, he's telling them, don't eat the blood. So why is it now prohibited from their diet? And what do you think might be some implications of that? Any thoughts on that, Bobby?
Well, medical reasons.
Okay, some medical reasons for that. Yep. Okay, so there could be some sickness attached to it. What else? Anything else?
I don't know if this is directly related to it, but there would come a time that man would take that blood and mix it with things and use it in pagan rituals.
Okay, so maybe there's some early warnings about paganism, some preemptive things on the part of God to do that, Gene?
Well, it says the life is in the blood.
It does say that.
And we learn later on that the blood of Christ is what saves us.
Yep.
And so it has a special place in God's heart.
I think, yeah. I think all of these, and it's not just limited to one thing. I think all of them could be true with perhaps deeper lessons. So let's get to that in just a moment. Here's an interesting thing. In verse 3, he says, everything moving that, and the idea is living. And he's contrasting to that with something that's previously dead, something that already died. So here's one thing. He's authorizing, number one, the consumption of animals, right? There was a direct command of God, a direct authorization of God at the very beginning. We just read it a moment ago where he says, I've given every green herb for food, right? So they were originally authorized to eat vegetables. In chapter 1, verse 29, and chapter 2, verse 16, you remember before he talks about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, you may freely eat of all the trees of the garden, except one. Right? So he gave them permission to eat of all the trees. So there was a vegetarian diet at the very, very beginning. But now he's authorizing the consumption of animals. The second implication is it's prohibiting the consumption of animals already deceased. So if you're walking through the woods and you see a rotting carcass of an animal, you can't eat that. God is saying don't eat something that is dead. You take something that's living, and you can kill that in order to eat it. But there's also the prohibition against, we would call it roadkill. And there's a reason for that. If you're going down the road and you see a deer sitting on the side of the road, and if you go down Sequoia Access, there's a ton of them all the time there because there's a lot of deer in the area. And skunks too, if that's your preference. You like to eat skunks, right? Certain times of year, February through about April, there'll be a lot of skunks on the road there. But you don't eat that. Why don't you eat it?
Well, one reason is, it kind of goes back to what Bobby says. Dead animals carry different things.
There's a hygiene. There's a physiological reason why God would not want them to do that. Don't eat roadkill, essentially is what he's saying. We don't do that because there's there are reasons that we would want to stay away from that, mostly disease, okay? I want to stop and have a talking point right here. Is a vegetarian diet morally, spiritually superior to a diet that includes meat? Are there people who think that? There are a lot of people today who think that spiritually a vegetarian diet is a spiritually superior diet. And it's just simply not true. From a spiritual standpoint, right? You can debate the health aspect of that all you want to. But spiritually, one is not better than the other. And I want to pause because I think this is real important, given our context today, especially with groups that advocate for no-meat diets and things of that sort, from almost a moral perspective, like it's moral to do this. Go with me to Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10. If God favored Noah and Noah was a righteous man and God told him to eat meat, it's okay to eat meat, okay? But look at Acts chapter 10. Remember the story, Cornelius is a man searching for truth, and now Peter is going to be dispatched to go preach the truth to Cornelius. And if you go to verse 9, the next day, as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, okay? Then he became very hungry. This is about noontime, by the way. Became very hungry and wanted to eat, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened, and an object like a great sheet bound at the four corners descending to him and letting down to the earth. In it were all kinds of four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, birds of the air. And a voice came to him and said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything uncommon or unclean." And a voice spoke to him again a second time, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common. Not call common." This was done 3 times, and the object was taken up into heaven again. So he gets a what would then be like a sheet chart sermon, a PowerPoint sermon. He gets an illustration of something. Now, the bigger principle here is, Gentiles, they have every bit as the right that you do to accept the gospel. You need to preach to Gentiles too. But there's also another lesson here. What's he told to do to the meat? Kill it and eat it. Eat it. All right, so there's a larger principle at work, but there's also an underlying principle here, which is that meat's okay to eat, and God was certainly talking about that. And then if you turn to 1 Timothy chapter 4, later Paul writes about this very issue, because even in Paul's day, they struggled with this idea that meat shouldn't be eaten. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some didn't want to go in the markets and buy it because it had been used in pagan things, and they didn't want to touch it because it had done that. So 1 Timothy chapter 4, look at verse 1. The Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving to those who believe and know the truth. And the thing they were telling them to abstain from was meat. And he said those things are meant to be received with thanksgiving. Okay? And then you could find another reference. We won't do it for the sake of time. Colossians 2, verses 16 through 23, which is a very similar context. The point is that God approves it. Eating meat is not immoral. It's not a spiritually immoral thing to do. And according to Romans 14, it's a matter of judgment. If a person says, "I really prefer not to eat meat," do they have the liberty to do that? Of course they do, if they want to do that. But they can't bind that as being a spiritually superior position. It's just not. It's not a spiritually superior position. And you could debate the dietary aspects of it, whether there's value in that or not. So man's diet now includes animals. Well, why is that? What major thing has just happened? Well, they've been killed. In what great event? Did the flood change the world? Topographically, geographically, environmentally, the world is different now. Is it possible that now this command comes because man actually needs animal protein as a part of his diet now because of some of the changes in the flood? Tommy, you had your hand up?
Well, another great example of that is God giving the people quail in
Yeah.
the wilderness.
Yeah,
They probably had other food, but
yeah.
he included that in their diet.
Yeah, it did. Absolutely. And like Gene was just saying, when they sacrificed, they did not discard the meat from the sacrifices. They would eat that. So God did not believe in wasting things. There's perhaps another reason here. Do you think that the Holy Spirit, in His infinite wisdom, knew that ages and ages and ages in advance there would be theories like evolutionary theory that would try to equate man and animals? And by drawing this distinction, what's He telling us? We are not equals. Man is far superior to animals. We are definitely different than that. Okay, we're definitely different than that. So a distinction is made here. And under the law of Moses, Gene mentioned the law of Moses a moment ago, in Leviticus chapter 17, there'll be, or chapter 11, there's going to be a distinction in the types of meats that they could consume under the law of Moses. But a restriction is placed now on the diet. No consumption of blood or literally bloody flesh. And, you're not going to eat something raw like that. So a couple of reasons why that might be. I think Tommy mentioned one, which is they would be in contact as time went on with pagan peoples, and pagan peoples would be very much involved in the consumption of blood. In fact, it was a pretty common practice for idolatrous peoples to drink blood as a part of drunken orgies that they were involved in. So there may have been some prohibition to pre-warn them about those. Obviously, Bobby mentioned sickness and disease. Also, by doing this, by not consuming the bloody flesh, what would it prevent in the relationship between man and animals? It would prevent abuse. All right, it would prevent abuse. You wouldn't be able to just sort of butcher something. It would have to be a clean kill if you did something like that in order to prevent that. And I think Gene mentioned the theological aspect of it. I think there's definitely embedded with this a deeper theological lesson that blood is used for sacrificial purposes, and that we're learning early on life is in the blood, that life is in the blood. Look at Leviticus chapter 17 real quick. Leviticus chapter 17. Now, it took people a longer time to recognize this. Through some scientific discovery, we know now the specific reasons for that, about hemoglobin in the blood and stuff like that. You got to have those blood cells to move oxygen and power the brain and all that. So, verse 11 of chapter 17, for the life of the flesh, verse 11 is where? The life of the flesh is in the blood. Chapter 17, verse 11. I've given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. And Revelation was progressive, right? God was bringing people along because, you get to, Galatians 4, in the fullness of time. God, He would reveal things throughout time to bring the understanding of people along. And I wonder if this is one of those things. He's teaching people early on about the value of blood, especially for sacrificial purposes. I do think it's interesting in this passage, he does say in verse 4, you shall not eat flesh with its life, And a translation of that could literally be with its soul. And there's a connection between life and blood. It's always been that way in the Bible. Of course, by scientific foreknowledge, again, we know that life is in the blood, but the Bible mentions often this language of the soul or the life. Lamentations 2:12, he talks about how their life is poured out. He's talking about their blood being poured out, but their life is poured out. In Jeremiah 2:34, he talks about the blood of their lives, because life is in the blood. And in Isaiah 53:12, speaking of Jesus, by the way, in that passage, he said his soul was poured out unto death. Well, what was poured out was his blood. He shed his blood at Calvary. And even cultures throughout time have acknowledged that. In Egyptian hieroglyphics, to represent life and soul, they would use a hawk, because a hawk was a blood eater. So they would use a hawk to represent that. Pythagoras was once on record saying that blood is the soul's food. And even the Stoics would argue that blood is the soul's producing cause. So there's been this thing throughout history where blood and life have been connected together. And God says it right here. So I think there's physical and spiritual reasons why both of these would be mentioned right here. But I think it's very, very interesting. All right, number 3. We'll spend the rest of our time here this morning. Number 3. God emphasizes the sanctity of life in verses 6 and 7. What is it that makes man so special And have we as a culture largely forgotten that today? And if you say yes, what makes you think that? So let's read verses 6 and 7, and then we'll talk about what is it that makes us special and why we would think that maybe we've, as a culture, forgotten that. Whoso sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made him, or he made man. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply it. What is it that makes us so special? All right, we're made in God's image. We harp that a lot, but it is so important. The Bible starts that way. We never leave that principle. We're made in God's image. Not physically. God's not a physical being. He doesn't have physical qualities. He's a spirit, an invisible spirit being. It's what he is. With these eyes, we couldn't see him if we tried. We just couldn't do that. But we are not divine, so we know that we're not made with divine attributes, but in some way we're made in his likeness. And we've discussed it many times before. We are made like him morally. We come into this earth as a moral being. We're moral decision makers. We are rational people. We have the ability to process information. That's the way God made us. And we're spiritual. We are an immortal soul. That's what we are. We have a shell that we come accustomed to, and we identify the physical part of each other. But we're more than that deep down inside. And there's no comparison then between the animal kingdom and human beings, because we are vastly different than that. We have intrinsic value and worth. It's to be regarded as sacred in the sense that we are made in God's image. We are unique, and that worth far excels the animal kingdom. Do you think as a culture we have forgotten that? Why would you think that? I think that's the number one thing. When we over the course of so many years murder 60 some odd million children, and we don't think a thing of it. And then what has been so upsetting is when you have the Dobbs case, and it didn't even overturn abortion. It just kicked it back to states, which is, from a constitutional perspective, is how it should have been in the beginning. States should decide for themselves. Is the number of people who are fighting to keep and latch onto that, right? And so even in states where there's some sense of morality, and they say, we're just not going to do it in this state because we think it's immoral to do that, where the people have just risen up in rebellion to that, the obsession with murdering people shows that we have no regard for the sanctity of life. We have none of it. Why is that? What's happened to us as a culture? Why have we forgotten that?
I think one reason is because people have become more self-centered.
Selfish? I'd agree with that.
Selfish in their
Yeah.
wants and desires.
Yeah.
That's all that matters.
Yeah.
And when you consider the abortion issue, most of the abortions are because
Convenience.
convenience,
Yep.
and the mother doesn't want her life interrupted.
Yep.
And we see that that's getting worse. And I mean, I read something just yesterday about culture and the experiments that were done with the animal kingdom, and how that the animal kingdom has certain patterns,
Yeah.
and they continue with those patterns, and then it equated that with our culture and the way people have really gone downhill.
Yeah.
And are more or less going like the animal kingdom without any conscious,
It's kind of Romans 1 all over again.
yeah.
You know, they forget the Creator and they start acting like the creation. That's sort of that thing. Do you think that we have been largely desensitized to the value of human life? I'm not, I'm not in a position to I can't make law where God didn't make it. And I understand people can watch a movie and not be affected by that. And you can play a video game. But do you think that by watching murder and by playing games where you murder people in video games, has that affected the way that we look at life? It's affected us. And especially in younger generations, because there's still a segment of the population in America, there's still a segment of the population that would oppose abortion, but they're largely older people over a certain age group who didn't grow up with those values. But it's almost unanimously within a younger dynamic. I mean, there's a few every now and then, but almost all younger people think it's okay, that it's for convenience or whatever. But it's also because they've been saturated with movies and video games where murder is commonplace, and we become desensitized. Gloria and then Jean. Gloria?
Not only is murder desensitized, but they murder these kids and then they just jump right back up. I
It's,
Because in their video games, that's what they do.
Yeah.
They kill them, but then the
Yeah.
guy pops right back up and fights again.
yeah.
I mean, it's a mindset they've got, and it's coming from those games.
Yeah, when there's no shock value in that anymore, because we understand accidents happen. We get that. But when you're talking about the taking of human life, it should shock us, and people aren't shocked by that anymore. It's just, we don't think about it. Gene? And then somebody else had their hand.
Don't understand that. I mean, you see the shootings that happen here in Chattanooga, Chicago, New York, all the time, and there's obviously no regard for human life.
I know.
Having been in the military,
Yep.
where your job
Sure.
is to kill
I
someone,
understand.
and you take that life, and that person's face is burned into your mind
Yeah.
for the rest of your life.
Sure. Absolutely.
You can't erase it.
That's right. And I saw several hands. I saw yours go up, Steve, and then Bobby. Just to illustrate, okay? It happens a lot. That is, I can remember in COVID, when this happened during COVID, and some of the riots that were taking place all over in COVID. There were people who would get pushed down and kicked and beaten with 2x4s and such. Do you remember what everybody standing around would do? While human life that's made in the image of God of heaven. We've lost our senses as a culture, and I don't mean to preach, but I mean, it's serious when God reminds us several times in the Bible that human life is precious, because of all life in this universe, only we are made in the image of God. And when people raise a hand to take human life in a non-judicial sense, in something like that, it is saying we have lost our mind as a culture. We've lost our senses when we can't look at human life and say, whatever it is, the way we interact with it and the way we treat it, that's a precious life made in the image of God. You are like God. God created you. You've been hand-fashioned by God to look like Him, spiritually, morally, and intellectually. And it needs to be treated that way, and we don't. Steve, or Bobby, and then Steve. I saw your hand first.
I was just gonna say, back up 40 years, before the video games, you did not hear about school shootings.
Yeah.
I agree with you that the rise of the video games.
It's had some effect. It's undeniable that and I know there have been efforts to deny that and say it doesn't mean a thing. But when you watch murder and on games you commit murder, it affects you. It affects the way you look at life, and it's not hard to, if we can say that pornography causes people, it disrupts the reality of sexuality and it transfers over into real sexual situations and it destroys it. The same principle is true with video games. If you're murdering people on video games and you translate that into real life, you're desensitized to real life. Steve?
October the 7th, when Hamas
Yeah.
began filming what they were doing.
Yeah.
And everyone was so shocked that they would be in.
Not everybody was shocked. Yeah.
And someone made the point, we do it every day in the United States.
We do it every day. And what they did was wrong and shocking, but that's always my thought. And people say, well, it's just terrible that they killed, 75 people and beheaded them. It's awful. But we murder thousands more every day. We walk into abortion clinics and stick a pair of pliers up and suck their brains out and dismember their bodies, and somehow we're not affected by that. And that's a precious person made in the image of God. And so we've got to be, Art?
1955, Paul Harvey, if I were the devil.
Yeah, that's a good one. And we see that playing out right now. And what he said is true. This is exactly what society has become. Life is precious. And that was being drilled into Noah's brain and his sons. You treat life with respect because life is made in my image. And that's what he was taught. All right, so next week, question number 4 in that list. Whoso sheds a man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. How does God feel about capital punishment? What was he telling Noah about how to punish crime? We're going to talk about that. So be prepared for that conversation. Thank you guys. Appreciate it so much. If anybody wants cranberry sauce, I've got a can full of it right here.